It started as an ordinary morning in our quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns are perfectly manicured, mailboxes are lined up like soldiers, and everyone seems to follow the unwritten code of neighborhood perfection. Life was simple, predictable, and comfortable. Our family had just moved into the neighborhood a few years prior, drawn by the charm of the streets, the proximity to good schools, and the promise of a peaceful community. Our golden retriever, Max, had been a constant source of joy since we adopted him as a puppy. He was more than a pet. He was family. He would run freely across our backyard, bask in the sun, and greet every neighbor with a friendly wag. Never a sign of aggression or nuisance. But one Thursday, everything changed with the arrival of a single piece of paper slipped under our front door. It was an official notice from the HOA, their crisp logo stamped at the top, making it impossible to ignore. At first glance, it seemed like a routine reminder, maybe a request to trim our hedges or repaint a mailbox. But as we read the words, our hearts sank. The notice declared in formal and unmistakable language that our dog, Max, was now considered non-compliant with HOA rules. The HOA stated that pets over a certain size or perceived as a risk were prohibited in the community. Max, our beloved golden retriever, was suddenly labeled illegal. We were stunned. How could something like this happen? We had lived here for years, paid our dues faithfully, followed every rule to the letter, and never once received a complaint about Max. Our dog never barked excessively, never damaged property, and certainly never posed any threat to anyone. It was as if the rules had been rewritten overnight, or perhaps someone had decided to single us out. Confusion quickly turned to frustration, and frustration to anger. The language of the letter was cold, bureaucratic, and final. It gave us a deadline of 30 days to either remove Max from the property or face escalating fines, legal action, and the potential involvement of law enforcement. For the first time, the quiet confidence we had in our neighborhood's fairness evaporated. We spent the day poring over HOA documents, searching for any clause that could justify this decision. Every rulebook we found seemed arbitrary at best, contradictory at worst. There was no mention of banning a specific breed, size, or even temperament. Max's presence in the neighborhood had always been accepted, even admired by many. Yet here we were, facing an ultimatum that threatened to take him away from us. We began to notice subtle changes around us. Neighbors who had always been friendly now glanced at us with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The normally welcoming streets suddenly felt tense, as if word of the HOA's notice had spread quietly through whispered conversations and knowing looks. It was the beginning of a wave we hadn't anticipated, a combination of scrutiny, judgment, and quiet intimidation that made our own home feel suddenly precarious. Determined not to surrender Max to some obscure regulation, we started documenting everything. Photos of the backyard where he played, videos of him interacting calmly with other neighbors' pets, records of all previous HOA correspondences, every piece of evidence that could demonstrate he was harmless. It was painstaking, exhausting work, but it was our only defense against an authority that seemed intent on punishing us unfairly. As days passed, the tension in the household grew. Simple routines became charged with anxiety. Walking Max around the neighborhood, once a relaxing ritual, now felt like a statement of defiance. Each glance from a neighbor or HOA member felt like a judgment, and every casual remark about rules or regulations carried the weight of potential consequences. It was a surreal transformation. Our familiar neighborhood had suddenly become a battlefield, and Max, our family's loyal companion, was at the center of it all. We also began to notice patterns in the HOA's communications. The language of their letters, their insistence on compliance, and the way they seemed to amplify minor issues into major infractions hinted at a deeper motivation. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about control. The HOA wielded authority not only as a mechanism to maintain order, but as a tool to manipulate, intimidate, and enforce conformity. We were learning that in this world, compliance was demanded not just for the sake of community standards, but for the sake of power. Despite the looming threat, a small spark of hope remained. There were still neighbors who remembered Max as the gentle, playful dog who had greeted them faithfully for years. They had seen him grow up, seen his gentle nature, and many were quietly sympathetic to our plight. If we could gather support, document Max's harmless behavior, and expose the arbitrary nature of the HOA's decree, there was a chance, not just to save Max, but to challenge the overreach of authority that had suddenly transformed our lives. As the first week passed, we realized that this was no longer just a personal issue. It had become a story of resistance, of pushing back against an overbearing system, and of standing up for what was right. Max, unaware of the chaos swirling around him, continued to live his life with the same boundless joy and innocence. That contrast, his innocence against the backdrop of bureaucracy and power, was both heartbreaking and motivating. By the end of the week, we made a decision. We would fight. We would research every possible loophole, consult with legal experts, and strategize with the neighbors who supported us. We would not let an arbitrary rule take away our family member without a fight. And as we prepared for the long battle ahead, we understood one painful truth. The moment we received that notice, nothing in our neighborhood or in our lives would ever be the same. The next steps were uncertain. The path ahead was challenging, and the conflict with the HOA was just beginning. But one thing was clear: Max was not going anywhere. After that first terrifying week, our lives became consumed by research, strategy, and observation. The more we dug into HOA regulations, the more absurd it seemed that Max could be labeled illegal. The rulebook cited vague statements about pet nuisances and community safety, but offered no concrete evidence or criteria that would justify banning a well-behaved dog. Every page of HOA bylaws seemed carefully written to give the board limitless authority, yet every paragraph could be questioned if read with scrutiny. We began documenting everything meticulously. Every walk Max took, every neighbor interaction, even the occasional bark, was recorded. Video footage showed him playing peacefully with other dogs in the community park, obeying commands, and interacting with children without incident. Photographs of his play area in our backyard demonstrated that it was safe, contained, and compliant with the environment. We were building a case not just for Max, but for anyone else who might face unreasonable HOA interference in the future. Simultaneously, we started talking quietly to neighbors. Some had always found the HOA's rules excessive. Others had been previously intimidated into silence. As we shared our story, a surprising number of residents came forward with their own grievances. Fines for minor landscaping infractions, letters about decorations, complaints about cars parked for mere hours. The community's undercurrent of frustration became apparent. What we initially thought was an isolated battle over Max was actually a symptom of something much larger, a system designed to control, intimidate, and profit from residents' fear of noncompliance. As the days passed, the HOA escalated. Letters turned more aggressive, emphasizing the consequences of continued noncompliance. They sent inspectors to measure Max's play area, cited us for hypothetical hazards, and even threatened legal action. Each communication was carefully phrased to intimidate and overwhelm. They seemed to count on the average homeowner giving in out of confusion, exhaustion, or fear. But we refused to surrender. In response, we began looking for legal loopholes. We studied local municipal codes, animal ordinances, and property rights laws, searching for any contradiction that could undermine the HOA's claim. Slowly, we started to piece together a strategy. For example, city ordinances allowed certain breeds and sizes of dogs, and property law gave homeowners some protections against overly restrictive HOA rules. We discovered that the HOA's own rules had gaps and inconsistencies, gaps we could exploit. But research alone wasn't enough. We needed allies. We arranged quiet meetings with neighbors who shared our concerns, building a coalition of residents willing to stand up to the HOA. Together, we began discussing ways to challenge the board's authority without violating any regulations ourselves. It became clear that the battle would not be won through confrontation alone. It would require strategy, unity, and the public exposure of the board's inconsistencies. Meanwhile, Max remained blissfully unaware of the storm surrounding him. He continued his routine, greeting every passerby with boundless energy and rolling in the grass without a care in the world. That contrast, the innocent normalcy of his life against the mounting tension of HOA scrutiny, was both a source of strength and a reminder of what was at stake. Every video we recorded, every photo we took, became a testament to his harmlessness and a tool in our growing arsenal. As the deadline from the first notice approached, our strategy began to crystallize. It was no longer just about keeping Max. It was about proving a point, challenging the system, and inspiring others in the community to question authority when it oversteps reasonable bounds. We had found our cause, and in that determination, the fear that had gripped us during the first week began to fade. And so, we prepared for the next phase: formal documentation, public exposure, and a direct confrontation with the HOA. The next chapter of this battle was about to begin, and it promised to test our resolve, creativity, and courage in ways we hadn't anticipated. Word of the HOA's attempt to ban Max began to ripple quietly through the neighborhood. Residents who had quietly endured overbearing rules now found their voices in our story. The sense of solidarity was unexpected but energizing. Homeowners who had once been reluctant to challenge the board now offered evidence of their own grievances: letters, photographs, and records of fines that seemed arbitrary or unfair. Suddenly, our fight was no longer just ours. It was symbolic of a larger struggle against an overreaching authority. We organized meetings in our backyard, always discreetly, never openly antagonizing the HOA. Coffee cups, notebooks, and laptops became tools for strategizing. Each neighbor contributed ideas, experiences, and insights, forming a collective knowledge base that allowed us to anticipate the board's potential moves. The more we spoke, the clearer it became. If the HOA could intimidate Max's family, it could intimidate anyone. By exposing their behavior, we were protecting more than just one dog. We were protecting the integrity of the entire community. With the coalition growing, we also planned a campaign to document everything publicly. We started creating a timeline of interactions with the HOA, recording letters, notices, and photos. We noted every contradictory statement, every unexplained rule, and every instance where board members acted beyond their authority. These records were intended not only for legal leverage, but also for the court of public opinion. In the age of viral videos and social media, perception mattered just as much as legality. Meanwhile, the HOA seemed to sense resistance. Letters arrived with sharper language, inspectors appeared more frequently, and rumors circulated about potential fines and legal actions. Their tactics were clear: intimidate, confuse, and isolate. But we were ready. Every neighbor who had joined our coalition now had copies of the regulations, legal precedents, and evidence. We were no longer a single household. We were a community united. In the midst of this tension, small victories began to emerge. Informal support from longtime residents created subtle pressure on the board. Friendly conversations, shared stories, and quiet acts of solidarity started to chip away at the HOA's facade of absolute authority. Max continued to serve as the symbol of our resistance, innocent, loving, and undeserving of the harassment he faced. By the end of this chapter, our plan was clear. We would expose the arbitrary nature of the HOA's actions, rally public support, and challenge the board's authority both legally and socially. The battle lines were drawn, and the community was united like never before. In the process of legal research, we stumbled upon a critical loophole buried deep within the municipal codes. While the HOA had authority to regulate minor nuisances, the city ordinances explicitly protected certain pet rights for homeowners. Specifically, they stated that any pet legally acquired, well-behaved, and confined to private property could not be banned arbitrarily by a homeowners association. The revelation electrified us. It was a legal lifeline we hadn't expected, a weapon that could completely undermine the HOA's claims against Max. Armed with this knowledge, we drafted a detailed report outlining the discrepancies between the HOA's demands and city regulations. Every paragraph of the HOA's previous notices was matched with a counterpoint supported by legal precedent. It was meticulous work, designed to leave no room for the board to argue. We also compiled our documentation of Max's behavior, neighbor testimonials, and visual evidence to reinforce our position. The strategy evolved further. We realized that simply presenting the loophole wouldn't be enough. The HOA's tactics relied on public perception as much as legal authority. We began creating a plan to share our story with a wider audience, carefully documenting every step. Videos of Max playing peacefully in the yard, images of his interactions with neighbors, and timelines of HOA harassment would serve both as proof and as a way to garner support. In essence, we were preparing a public relations campaign alongside a legal defense. As the deadline from the initial notice approached, the tension reached a peak. Every trip outside with Max felt like a potential confrontation. Every neighbor interaction was a subtle test of loyalty, and every letter from the board carried the weight of escalation. Yet the discovery of the loophole gave us confidence. The fear that had dominated our first days was slowly replaced with determination. We were no longer fighting blindly. We had leverage, allies, and a clear path forward. The stage was set. With evidence compiled, neighbors aligned, and a legal loophole uncovered, the next phase would involve presenting our findings to the board, documenting their reaction, and preparing to expose any overreach publicly. Max, blissfully unaware of his role as the symbol of resistance, continued to live his life with the same boundless joy. But for us, every moment was charged with anticipation. The day of confrontation arrived. We formally presented our findings to the HOA board, delivering a dossier filled with evidence, legal references, and testimonials from neighbors. The board members, who had previously wielded authority with confidence, were visibly unprepared for the detailed, organized, and legally substantiated challenge before them. It was clear that they had underestimated our resolve. During the presentation, we outlined every instance of arbitrary action, highlighted the contradictions in their own rules, and demonstrated how their demands violated city ordinances. The room, once dominated by the board's authority, now felt tense, uncertain, and defensive. It was the first time we realized the power of preparation and community support against a seemingly untouchable authority. Outside the meeting, neighbors quietly gathered, sharing the unfolding events and lending moral support. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, and several community members who had previously felt powerless now began to recognize their collective strength. Max's presence, calm and friendly, became a symbol of the household's integrity and the absurdity of the HOA's actions. The HOA attempted to push back, citing vague claims and hypothetical risks. But each point was countered by documented evidence, legal precedent, and community witness statements. It became increasingly apparent that their intimidation tactics could no longer succeed in the face of transparency, preparation, and public scrutiny. By the end of the confrontation, it was undeniable. The board had overstepped its authority, and our defense had exposed their arbitrary enforcement. The meeting concluded with the board reluctantly acknowledging the limitations of their power and agreeing to withdraw the notice against Max. With the HOA's notice officially rescinded, life slowly returned to normal. Max roamed freely once more, the neighborhood's tension eased, and the community began to heal from weeks of anxiety and confrontation. But the impact of the conflict lingered. Residents who had witnessed the events were more aware of their rights, more prepared to challenge overreach, and more united as a community. Our battle had started as a personal struggle to protect Max, but it evolved into a broader lesson about authority, power, and community solidarity. The overbearing tactics of the HOA had been exposed, their influence diminished, and the neighborhood learned that compliance should never come at the expense of fairness, justice, or common sense. The experience also left us with lasting reflections. The sense of helplessness in the face of bureaucracy, the stress of defending a beloved pet, and the challenge of rallying neighbors against intimidation were all intense. Yet the triumph brought a sense of empowerment, a reminder that knowledge, preparation, and community support can overcome even the most entrenched authority. Max continued to live as he always had, blissfully unaware of the symbolic role he had played. For us, the story would be remembered not just as a victory for a dog, but as proof that standing up to unfair rules, exposing arbitrary enforcement, and uniting a community can produce real change. In the end, the neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm, but the memory of those weeks and the lessons learned remained. We had not only saved Max, but we had also reminded everyone that fairness, reason, and courage could triumph over bureaucracy, intimidation, and fear.